Welcome to U.S. Visa Questions Answered Here.
Welcome to U.S. Visa Questions Answered Here with Immigration Attorney Frances Hayden. For decades, Frances has focused on consular processing of non-immigrant visas at U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide, with a special emphasis on third country national visa processing. I'm your host, Sophia Morales, and today's episode is all about, am I in danger of losing my U.S. permanent residence? Welcome, Frances. I'm so happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Sophia.
I think I mentioned before we got on the air here that this is near and dear to my heart, being married to an immigrant who is now a naturalized citizen. And I understand how anxiety-producing this entire process can be, even in good times. And right now, things are a little turbulent.
Very chaotic, exactly. And it creates a ton of anxiety.
Absolutely. So let's get right to the meat of the matter. What are the ways a U.S. green card holder could lose their permanent residence?
Well, there's several ways that people often are not aware of. The first one that's very common is staying outside the United States too much time. I find a lot of my clients are not aware of this, even though I send them a notice of it as soon as they get their green card, that you can't stay out too long or they'll take your green card away. The basic rule is you got to come back before 6 months. Otherwise, it creates a presumption that you're abandoning your green card.
Okay, yeah.
You can overcome that presumption by showing your ties to the U.S., like having a bank account, having a job, having a residence, having family. If you stay out more than a year, if you stay out more than 6 months, it's not as serious, but it's not recommended. If you stay out over a year, it's a problem, and you are considered to have abandoned your residency. And so the solution to that is to get a reentry permit if you need to be outside the United States for some reason, work or personal. You can file paperwork to allow you to stay out for 2 years without losing your green card. That's important to know. The other is crimes, certain serious crimes, felonies, what we call aggravated felonies, which usually involve some kind of violence or weapons. Almost any drug offense, any kind of fraud. If you commit fraud on something or you have previously committed fraud, or, and this is a big one these days, national security concerns, such as being a member of a terrorist group, or, as we're seeing now, even exercising your right to free speech can get you into trouble. So if you're a threat to national security, you can lose your green card. There does need to be a hearing about that, but it's now a more serious concern than ever before.
Yeah, I would say, because it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they're scooping people up and just hauling them out of the country without due process and hearings and that sort of thing.
Yes, and that's a subject for another podcast, is what is due process?
Yeah.
It's kind of an elusive concept that everybody needs to know about. Permanent residents generally are entitled to, well, obviously, they're entitled to due process and they're entitled to a hearing. It depends on the circumstances in which the government decides to take an interest in them. If they're within the United States, as you say, they can be scooped up and detained. They really should not be removed, but I know we've all heard stories about how this government is removing people in error and also removing some U.S. citizens. So if you're coming in from outside, you might run into problems there and detained when you're trying to re-enter the United States. Also a subject for another podcast, that how to prepare for entry.
Absolutely.
Big anxiety point these days.
So circling back to the permanent residence and green card issue, where is the decision about revoking a green card made? How does that process play out?
It's made in immigration court, which is an administrative court. And it seems to be happening that people are being detained at entry and then they should still go to immigration court. The famous case of the student at Columbia who was picked up, who's a green card holder, is now in detention awaiting his hearing in immigration court to see whether or not he can maintain his permanent residence. The Attorney General is taking the position now, this was not a position that the government exercised very much before, that if an individuals' activities in the United States would have a serious consequence on foreign policy, then they can take their green card away. That's being contested and debated and litigated now, so we'll see what happens. The question becomes, is it true that they really would have a potentially serious effect on foreign policy, or is that just
I was going to say, yeah, it's a student at Columbia, really? Okay.
But the Secretary of State does have some authority to intervene in these kind of cases, and it's kind of obscure. It stems from a provision in law from the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 that says that Attorney General can deport people who are considered to cause serious foreign policy problems. This has not been fully litigated. It has not been put into action. And so we have a lot to learn with the cases that are in process right now, because these issues are being debated and litigated actively at this moment.
So say we finally get that hearing date. What happens at the hearing?
Well, at the hearing, there's an immigration judge, there's an attorney for the government, and then hopefully the individual is represented by an attorney. The government has the burden of proving that you are no longer entitled to your permanent residence.
Can we back up a second? You made the statement, hopefully they have an attorney. Is this not a situation where you can be assigned one to defend you?
No, it's different than criminal court. That's a very good question. In criminal court, there's a whole group of attorneys who are there to represent you if you can't afford your own. In immigration court, it's not the same. You have fewer rights. There are not public defenders as we know them in the criminal context. There are a lot of volunteer organizations that will provide attorneys to people who cannot afford them in immigration court. But if the individual does not get one of those and cannot afford to pay for one, they can end up unrepresented in court. And we've heard
that sounds really bad.
It's very bad. And we've heard stories recently. I think there were government funded attorneys that were representing children who are come into the United States unaccompanied, and they're sent to immigration court. And so there were attorneys being provided to them, and this administration took the funding away for that. So now there is a possibility that children who may not even speak English could be representing themselves in immigration.
Oh, heavens. How I can't even imagine as an adult how distressing and confusing that would be for me, let alone a child, not of age, not speaking the language, separated potentially from my parents. Are you kidding?
Yes, this is a major issue right now. And charitable organizations have to step into that gap and provide representation. But as you can imagine, the numbers of people being detained are much larger than the capacity for these people to represent them. So this is a major issue. Even if you are being given a hearing, part of due process is having the ability to get legal counsel. But it seems to be a big gap in our system that in the immigration context, it's not automatically provided.
Wow. Okay. So where would I go look for one of these if someone that I love or...
Well, there are, if you are in immigration court, normally, in my experience, the judge will hand you a list of charitable organizations and will delay the hearing until you have the opportunity, like maybe a couple of weeks, to get an attorney. You can also look online. In the high-profile cases that we're seeing right now, the ACLU is getting very involved, and prominent law firms are getting involved. But for the average person, it's really hard because you can contact a charitable organization and they may not have somebody available for you at that time. Yeah. So it causes delays in immigration court because if someone comes back and they're still not represented, depending on the judge, they usually will give another continuance of the hearing until the person can try more to get representation. But it's a struggle.
Okay, so back to the hearing. Now that we know how to become represented potentially, break it down for us how this goes.
Well, basically, the government presents their case, and the green card holder has the ability to present their defense For example, in the case of saying that you are going to severely influence foreign policy, the attorney for the resident in this case would have the ability to prove that that's simply not true, that the person is not going to have negative influence on foreign policy. Or in the case of somebody like the famous case of Obregón Garcia, who was sent to El Salvador, if he were given a hearing, he would need to prove that he's not a member of a criminal gang and that he's not a danger to the United States. And then the judge makes a decision.
How do you prove a negative, though? I mean, really, it's like, okay, I've never been to New York. I've never, associated with these people. How do you prove that?
That's the challenge for the attorneys. That comes up in several contexts in immigration law. The other context in which it comes up a lot is when you're applying for a visa and you have to prove that you're not planning to immigrate to the United States. So,
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And in the context of proving you're not a gang member, honestly, I don't know. That's a huge challenge. I'm following closely to see how these attorneys, and there are many of them in the high profile cases who are very, very good, who are going to make their arguments.
Oh, wow. I really feel for the people who are trapped in this right now.
I do too.
Okay, so that's what goes on during the hearing. Is there like an immediate ruling at the end of this?
Yes. Yeah. Normally there's an immediate ruling, and the immigration judge gives his reasons, makes his finding of credibility regarding evidence and witnesses. And if the ruling is negative, the permanent resident could be deported.
Like right now, or is there like a time period that you can appeal the decision?
Yes, there is the ability to appeal, and that's the good news. There's an Immigration Board of Appeals that you can send your case to, and the thing that happens there is that the person ends up staying a long time while they wait for the Board of Immigration Appeals, we call it the BIA, to make a decision. That's fine if you have been paroled into the United States and you're free, but in the case of many of these people now, they're detaining them, and so they can remain in detention during the appeal period. Theoretically, if the Board of Immigration Appeals agrees with the government, in other words, the people that want to deport you, you could be deported at that point. If they agree with you, of course, you maintain your permanent residency and you are not deportable. Even the decision of the Board of Immigration Appeals can be appealed. And eventually, a case like this, theoretically, could end up in the U.S. Supreme Court after all the appeals. Very doubtful, because the prospect of the Supreme Court accepting the case, because they have full discretion as to what they accept, is low. But also, it's an extremely expensive proposition. Now, I would say in these high-profile cases, it's possible that it could go very high up in the court system, because the resources are there for people who are being represented by an organization like the ACLU. And they want to fight all the way to the top, because this kind of decision can affect so many other people who are in similar situations. It's very rare, but we're in rare times, and it could happen that it would be appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court.
And so you mentioned that you might be paroled into the community or you might be detained. Wow. What really influences that decision?
The government that we have now is fighting to detain many people. And so under previous administrations, parole would have been more common. But now, because they're making this argument that you are a danger in one way or another, either being a gang member or being a criminal, being endangering U.S. foreign policy, it's less likely that people will be released automatically. And the way that is tested is that the applicant, in this case, if it's a permanent resident, can file a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. And that is basically asking to be released, literally in Latin, it means to release the body, that the government isn't entitled to keep you under these circumstances. And these are fights that are already going on. Habeas corpus is what the Supreme Court recently said needs to be used in the case of people who are being detained, even the people who were wrongfully sequestered to El Salvador have a habeas corpus right and can file even though they're already outside the United States, because constructively the US government is still in charge of their detention. So that's a huge right, and it's a huge action that can be taken. Again, you're looking at needing to have the resources to go into federal court and hire an attorney who is familiar with that kind of writ of habeas corpus and to get released. I think we're going to see a tremendous number of these kinds of cases, because even permanent residents can be detained, as in the case of Mr. Khalil, who is detained in Louisiana awaiting his immigration hearing. I forget exactly what date it is, but he has been in detention for months. And the sad story is that his wife had their first baby while he was in detention. He wasn't allowed to be temporarily released for that event. So the issue of detention is huge, and it can happen not just to people who are here undocumented, but it can happen to people who are here who entered on visas. It can happen to legal permanent residents. And so I think this is part of where all the anxiety comes from.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Hearing about detentions, and people are terrified of being detained because the conditions are bad. They're moving people from certain regions to others where they have more favorable judges in the federal district court where the habeas writs are being filed. And so they, rather than having you in New York, they send you to Louisiana, where the district courts tend to be on the more conservative side. And so they're moving people around for that purpose, to get the right venue to be allowed to keep them in detention for extremely long periods of time.
So how does the right to free speech figure into this sort of situation? Is this a moment to kind of sit down and shut up, or?
Well, it's huge and really confusing to so many people, including many friends I have and many people that contact me, because some people I know make their living by criticizing the government.
Yes.
And
if you're anywhere in, the news media, you're probably walking that line.
Yes, and there are many people who are immigrants in that area. So they are terrified to travel. The right to free speech does cover everyone in the U.S., regardless of their citizenship status, and that includes undocumented people. So this is what confuses many, because if that's true, how can someone like Khalil be detained for his speech activities that he participated in? It's because the government's position is that any advocacy on the part of the Palestinian cause would have a serious foreign policy consequence.
Okay, now, I can see where they would shoehorn that in there, yeah.
Yeah, so whether or not this government position is going to hold up remains to be seen. And it's really a bitter fight, because this right to free speech is something that we depend on. And if the government can just swoop you up for your speech, it's a major change, really, in our country. It hasn't really been tested much in modern times. 30 years ago, it was tested when the government was deporting a citizen of Mexico at that time who faced criminal charges in his home country. The facts of the case are a little different, but the interesting thing about it is that in that case, Marianne Trump Barry, the sister of Donald Trump, who was a federal judge, ruled that the law was unconstitutional. So that's the precedent on it, that they're basically, because it wasn't a U.S. Supreme Court decision, it was a district court decision. It doesn't govern all the other judges in the U.S., but it has been found to be unconstitutional. And the position of the government is that it's not about free speech, that it's about the removal because they're interfering with foreign policy, which to me seems like a real stretch. I think to the average person, it seems like a real stretch. Meanwhile, he's in detention while this is being...
And his life has been completely blown to smithereens.
Right. Yep. So it's a really interesting legal scenario at this point in time that if you're interested in this sort of thing, it's fascinating to follow. It's better than any series on Netflix, just following the court cases and the decisions that the courts are making that are fascinating. It moves a little slowly, but it's happening right before our eyes. These things are being tested, and I think the future of our country is being challenged and debated.
So at the top of this discussion, we listed a number of ways that a green card holder could lose their permanent residence. Are there any other ways you could lose your green card?
There are. One is that you voluntarily surrender your green card. Many people do this for many reasons. Tax reasons, perhaps. Whenever someone contacts me that wants to voluntarily give up their green card, and I have done these applications many times, I tell them, first thing you have to do is contact a really good accountant that is familiar with international tax law, because there can be tax consequences to doing that. The U.S. government can tax all of your worldwide assets at the highest possible rate on the day you give up your green card under certain conditions. So people need to be informed about that. Another way is to fail to remove the conditions on your green card. In marriage cases and in investment cases known as EB-5, you get a conditional green card that lasts for 2 years, and you can file to remove the conditions on it 90 days before it expires. If you fail to file to remove the conditions on it, then you become deportable and you lose your residency.
Wow.
Most people are aware of that, and most people do file the extra form they need to file to remove the conditions. I have honestly, ever since conditional residency came in, which wasn't always there, I've yet to see somebody be deported or have their residency taken away based on it. Usually there's a little bit of wiggle room and you can file late, but things are changing and there may no longer be any tolerance. So another thing to be aware of.
Yeah, this has all been really good information. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today, Frances.
You're very welcome. My last word of wisdom is go ahead and apply for U.S. citizenship if you are eligible, because pretty much all these problems go away if you are a U.S. citizen.
Thanks for joining us on U.S. Visa Questions Answered Here with Immigration Attorney Frances Hayden.
To connect with Frances and her team, visit haydenlaw.com and be sure to like, subscribe, and review so other people get access to this important content.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.